William was 15 years old when his mother died. That is a fact so plain and so blunt that it is easy to read past it without stopping, without letting it register the way it should. 15. Old enough to understand exactly what had happened, what it meant, what was gone, and young enough that he would spend the rest of his life being shaped by it in ways that no amount of time or therapy or public duty would entirely resolve. The lesson he carried from Diana is not one that can be extracted from a single moment or a single speech. It accumulated across years of watching her work, years of watching how she moved through the world and how the world responded, and then years of absence in which what she had shown him became, if anything, more visible because she was no longer there to show it in real time. The lesson, in the plainest possible terms, is this: people can tell the difference between someone who is genuinely paying attention to them and someone who is going through the motions of paying attention. Diana knew this. She acted on it in a way that was unusual enough inside the royal family to still be talked about decades after her death, and William has carried that knowledge into his own public life in ways that are visible to anyone watching carefully. But to understand why it matters, you have to understand where Diana learned it herself, and what it cost her to apply it inside an institution that was not always comfortable with what she was doing. She did not come from a political family in any useful sense. Her father, Earl Spencer, was old aristocracy. She had been raised in the way that the English upper classes raised their daughters in those years, with an assumption of social confidence and very little preparation for a life conducted at the level of intensity that being Princess of Wales would require. The accounts of her early years inside the royal family describe someone who was isolated and struggling in ways that the institution she had married into did not have good mechanisms for responding to. She was expected to perform a role she had not been trained for, alongside people who had grown up inside that role and could not fully see why she was finding it so difficult, in front of a public that adored the image of her without knowing anything real about who she was. It was, by her own account in the 1995 interview with Martin Bashir, an experience that damaged her considerably before she found her way through it. What she found, when she found it, was that the work itself was the thing that made the most sense to her, not the ceremonial side of royal life, not the dinners and the portraits and the formal occasions that consume so much of what the royal calendar requires, but the actual contact with people who were going through something difficult. She began visiting hospices and hospitals in the early years of her marriage, and what people who were in those rooms with her describe is not a royal figure performing compassion for a camera, but someone who was genuinely present in a way that was unusual. She sat on the edge of beds. She held hands. She made eye contact and kept it. She asked questions and then listened to the answers, rather than waiting for her turn to say something appropriate and move on. These are not complicated things in the abstract. In the context of a royal visit, conducted under the pressure of a program and a watching press and the weight of an institution expecting a certain kind of performance, they require a degree of deliberate choice and personal discipline that is easy to underestimate. The moment that became one of the most widely discussed of her public career was the visit to an AIDS hospice in London in 1987, when she shook hands without gloves with a patient at a time when public fear of HIV and AIDS was still severe and largely irrational, and when the act carried a public message that many health advocates believed was more effective than anything a formal campaign could have achieved. That moment was not scripted. It was not the result of a communication strategy or a press office decision. It came from the same instinct that made her sit on the edge of the bed rather than standing at a professional distance. The same instinct that told her the difference between what the visit was supposed to look like and what it might actually do for the person in front of her. William saw this. Not that particular moment in exactly that way, because he was a small child in 1987, but he grew up watching her work, and he grew up hearing people talk about what her presence had meant to them, and he absorbed something from that over years of proximity that went into his understanding of what the job actually required as opposed to what it formally asked for. There is a version of the lesson Diana was teaching that could be stated as a principle about royal duty, about the obligation of people in positions of privilege and visibility to use that visibility responsibly. That version is true, but it is also a bit flat, a bit abstracted from the actual experience of it. The version William appears to have internalized is more concrete and more demanding. It is that your physical presence with another person, the quality of attention you bring to a conversation or an encounter, matters more than almost anything else you can bring. The title, the formal occasion, the photograph afterward, none of that is what the person in the hospital bed or the food bank or the charity waiting room actually takes away from the encounter. What they take away is whether you were actually there with them or whether you were elsewhere inside yourself performing the motions of being there. That is a demanding standard to apply to a public life that requires attending hundreds of official events per year, events that range in their personal interest and meaning from very engaging to quite repetitive. Diana managed it by being genuinely interested in the people she met, or by finding the part of any encounter that was genuinely interesting, which is not quite the same thing but produces a similar result. Whether William manages it the same way, or has found his own version of it, is something that people who observe his public work have noted with varying degrees of generosity. The consensus among those who cover the royal family seriously is that he is, in certain kinds of settings and with certain kinds of people, capable of the same quality of presence that his mother had. In other settings, he appears less comfortable, more guarded, more aware of the institutional weight of what he is doing, and less able to set it aside in the way she could. This is not a criticism so much as an observation about two different people doing the same job with different personal resources. Diana's ease with strangers was real, but it was also in some ways a product of the isolation she experienced inside the palace. She found it easier, by her own account, to connect with people outside the institution than with people inside it, and that disposition served her public work even as it complicated her private life. William grew up inside the institution in a way Diana never did. He was born into it, has always known how to read it, and that gives him a fluency in its workings that she had to struggle to acquire. The cost of that fluency may be a slight formality of manner in some settings, a residual awareness of the role that can occasionally feel like a layer of glass between him and the person he is talking to. The work he has chosen to focus on in his own public career carries something of his mother's orientation, even if it expresses it differently. The Earth-Shot Prize, his work on homelessness through the Homewards Initiative, his earlier engagement with mental health through the Heads Together campaign that he founded alongside Catherine and Harry before the family rift made joint work impossible, all of these reflect a consistent choice to attach his name and his attention to things that deal in human difficulty rather than institutional prestige. These are not the projects of someone who has simply defaulted to the charitable work that royal figures are traditionally expected to support. They have a texture of personal investment that those who have followed them over time tend to find credible. The Heads Together campaign is worth examining for a moment because it is the place where the lesson Diana taught became most explicitly a matter of public discussion. When William, Catherine, and Harry launched that campaign in 2016 and began speaking openly about mental health, about their own experiences with grief and loss, and the pressure of their circumstances, the response was significant. Part of what made it significant was that it was unusual. The royal family has not historically been an institution that modeled emotional openness. For reasons that have as much to do with the personal psychology of its members as with deliberate institutional strategy. The reserve that characterized how the family operated the sense that personal difficulty was managed privately and displayed publicly only as stoicism, was something that Diana explicitly departed from, and that the institution was not entirely comfortable with when she did. What William was doing with Heads Together was, in one reading, a continuation of what his mother had done. Not a copy of it, not a theatrical reproduction of her gestures, but the same underlying decision to use the visibility the institution provides to bring attention to something that people were not talking about enough, and that the presence of a royal figure in the conversation could help normalize. Diana used her visits to hospices and her willingness to sit with people who were dying to normalize the idea that such people deserve the full attention of another human being, that the dying and the sick and the marginalized were not to be looked past. William used his willingness to speak about his own grief, about the difficulty he experienced in the years after his mother died, and the time he has said he lost to not processing it properly, to normalize the idea that mental health was something anyone could struggle with regardless of how their life looked from the outside. The personal dimension of what he disclosed is worth being careful about. He has said, in various interviews across the years, that the period following Diana's death was difficult in ways that took him a long time to fully reckon with. He has said that he went through a period of avoiding thinking about her because it was too painful, and that when he did begin to think about her more directly, it was in the context of preparing for fatherhood. People who have written carefully about the royal family's emotional history note that the family's response to Diana's death, in the immediate days following the accident and in the years afterward, was shaped by the same patterns of reserve and managed stoicism that had characterized how the family operated more generally. Charles was grieving his own loss and managing two sons in shock. The instinct of the institution was toward continuity and composure. Whether that was the right response for two boys who had just lost their mother is a question that William has addressed obliquely in interviews rather than directly, but the direction of his oblique comments is fairly clear. He has said he wishes he had spoken to someone sooner. He has said the grief was there, whether or not he acknowledged it. He has said that becoming a father made him want to be more present for his children than he sometimes felt able to be in the years when the loss was unprocessed. None of this is self-pity or an accusation directed at anyone in particular. It is an honest account of what it is actually like to lose a parent as a child and to grow up inside an institution whose emotional grammar does not have an obvious space for that kind of loss to be processed out loud. The fact that he is willing to say these things at all connects directly back to what Diana was doing when she sat on the edge of hospital beds and held the hands of dying strangers. She was refusing to pretend that the difficulty wasn't there. She was insisting, through her physical presence and her quality of attention, that the difficult things were worth attending to, that looking away was a choice and not the only available one. William's willingness to speak about his own grief, to use the platform his position gives him to say things that are true but uncomfortable, rather than things that are comfortable but not very true, is the same refusal in a different register. Catherine's influence on this dimension of his public life should not be understated, though it is genuinely difficult to assess from outside. Those who know them together describe someone who brought considerable emotional intelligence to a relationship with a person who was, by his own account, still working through a good deal of unprocessed feeling when they met. She is, in the observation of people who have seen them work together over many years, someone who has supported his willingness to be more emotionally direct in his public work than the family he grew up in typically modeled. The extent to which the lesson Diana was teaching has been received and applied in William's adult life is not separable from who he chose to build that life with. The lesson shows up in places that are less obviously connected to emotional openness or charitable causes. It shows up in how he conducts himself at official engagements in the documented pattern of lingering past schedule to finish a conversation rather than being moved along at the pace the program requires, in the reports from schools and community organizations that have had royal visits about what those visits actually felt like to the people in the room. It shows up in the choice of what causes to attach his name to, which consistently favor the kinds of difficulty that institutions tend to prefer to look past rather than the kinds of difficulty that come with obvious prestige and easy headlines. It shows up in the way he has spoken about his children and his determination to give them a childhood that has some texture of normalcy to it, in the decisions he and Catherine have made about how George, Charlotte, and Louis are raised that reflect the same orientation Diana had toward her own sons, a belief that the point of a childhood is not to prepare you for the performance of royalty, but to give you enough of an actual self that the performance, when it comes, has something real behind it. What Diana was doing when she took William and Harry to McDonald's, when she took them on the tube, when she arranged for them to see how ordinary life operated in Britain in ways that palace life did not automatically provide, was trying to ensure that they would not grow up entirely inside the institution's idea of what the world was like. She was trying to give them enough contact with reality as other people lived it, that they would not, as adults, have to fake empathy for experiences they could not actually imagine. Whether she succeeded, and in what measure, is something that William has spoken about carefully, attributing to those early experiences a significance in how he thinks about the work he does now. None of this is to say that William is Diana, or that the lesson she taught has been received without complication or perfectly applied. He's a different person, in a different position, in a different era. The media environment he navigates is more fragmented and more hostile in certain ways than the one she worked in, even given how harshly certain sections of the press treated her during her lifetime. The relationship with the press that he and Catherine have chosen is more guarded than Diana's was, and that guardedness has its own costs in terms of the kind of access and intimacy that Diana offered the public and that the public responded to so powerfully. The balance he is trying to strike between protecting his family's privacy and maintaining the connection with the public that the monarchy's continued relevance depends on is genuinely difficult, and he has not always found it cleanly. But the underlying orientation is his mother's. The belief that presence is not the same as performance, that attention is not the same as attendance, that a royal visit that leaves the person visited feeling genuinely seen is worth more than one that simply fulfills the schedule and looks good in the photograph. That is what Diana showed him, not in a single conversation or a deliberate lesson, but across years of watching her bring that quality to her work and seeing what it produced in the people she brought it to. He was 15 years old when she died. He is in his 40s now, a father 3 times over, heir to a throne he has been preparing for his entire life, working through questions about what kind of monarchy he intends to lead when his turn comes. The lesson is not a memory at this point. It is a working part of how he understands the job. It is in the choices he makes about what to say and what to do and where to put his attention. It is in the determination visible in his public record over many years to be genuinely present with people who are going through something difficult rather than simply near them. Diana taught it without announcing it as a teaching. She just did the work in the way she had decided to do it, and her sons were watching. That is probably how she would have wanted it. To understand how unusual Diana's approach actually was inside the institution she married into, it helps to have some sense of the baseline she was departing from. The British royal family has, across its modern history, operated according to a logic of managed distance. The monarch and the working royals are visible, but visibility is not intimacy. They appear, they preside. They represent something larger than themselves, And the logic of that larger thing requires a certain removal from the ordinary texture of human contact. You do not hug strangers as a matter of royal protocol. You do not sit on the floor. You do not linger in a way that disrupts the schedule, because the schedule is itself a form of institutional communication, a message that the institution is organized and purposeful and knows where it is going next. Diana broke with all of this, not always consciously and not always without cost. The same quality that made her so arresting in a hospital room made her difficult inside the formal machinery of royal life, because that quality required her to respond to what was actually in front of her rather than to what the program said was supposed to happen. She was not good at managing distance. She found it actively uncomfortable to maintain the professional remove that the institution expected. This was sometimes experienced by those around her as a boundary problem, as an instability, as evidence that she had not fully grasped the nature of the role she was performing. In retrospect, and with the benefit of watching what her way of working produced in the people she came into contact with, it looks more like a clear-eyed refusal to do the work badly just because doing it well required breaking with what the institution expected. William appears to have retained from his observation of her not just the lesson about presence, but the understanding that applying it inside the royal institution requires constant negotiation with an environment that does not always support it. He has spoken in interviews about the difficulty of maintaining genuine connection with people across the full range of what his public life requires, about the way that a very full program of official engagements can, if you are not careful, become something you perform rather than something you actually do. He has described the deliberate effort he makes to ensure that individual conversations have some quality of real attention rather than simply functional completion. The effort itself, the fact that it requires effort, is an honest acknowledgement that the lesson Diana taught does not apply itself automatically in an institutional context. It has to be chosen repeatedly in circumstances that do not always make it easy. The particular context in which this lesson has been most severely tested in William's adult life is also the one that is most connected to his own history of loss. The work around mental health and the conversations he has conducted in that space over the past decade. Speaking publicly about your own psychological difficulty when you are the heir to the throne of one of the most visible monarchies in the world requires exactly the kind of deliberate choice not to maintain protective distance that Diana made when she refused to wear gloves. The gesture is different, the setting is different, but the underlying decision is the same: to be genuinely present with something that is real, rather than performing a sanitized version of it that everyone in the room can be comfortable with. He has spoken about the year he spent working as an air ambulance pilot in East Anglia, a period that brought him into regular contact with people experiencing acute medical emergencies, as one that affected him in ways he has described as difficult to fully explain in retrospect. He has said that dealing with grief in that professional context, with people who had just lost someone or were about to lose someone, brought up his own history with loss in ways that he was not always prepared for. He has also said that the experience of that work, of being genuinely useful to people in the worst moments of their lives, gave him a sense of the difference between the kind of presence that his position can offer and the kind that a person with a specific skill in a specific crisis can offer. Both matter. They matter differently. Understanding the difference is itself a form of the lesson Diana was teaching. Being clear-eyed about what you can actually give rather than performing a version of it that is more comfortable for you to sustain. The Homewards Initiative, which William launched in 2023 with the aim of demonstrating that homelessness can be ended rather than merely managed, carries this same quality of wanting to be useful in a specific way rather than visible in a general one. The choice of homelessness as the focus is worth considering. It is not an easy cause to attach a royal name to not in the sense of generating approval and warm coverage. It is a cause that, to be engaged with seriously rather than ceremonially, requires actually spending time with people whose circumstances are very difficult and whose daily reality is not something that a royal visit typically tries to make visible in any honest way. The stated ambition of the initiative, which is to work across 6 locations in the United Kingdom and to build models for ending homelessness that can be shared nationally, requires the kind of sustained, unglamorous engagement that does not produce easy wins or obvious milestones. It is the kind of commitment that his mother would have recognized. The relationship between William and Harry, before the rupture that became public in the years following Harry's marriage to Meghan, is relevant here because it shows something about how the lesson Diana taught was received differently by 2 people who were both present for it. Harry has spoken extensively about his own grief and his own psychological difficulty in the years since 2017, more extensively and more publicly than William has. He has taken the Diana lesson about not maintaining false composure and applied it in a way that is arguably even more direct, even less bound by institutional expectation than what William has done. The debate about which approach is more genuine or more appropriate or more useful is one that has generated an enormous amount of public and press commentary, most of it not particularly illuminating. What is more interesting and less often discussed is what the divergence between them suggests about the complexity of the lesson itself. Diana was showing them something real and important about what it means to pay genuine attention to people who are in difficulty. She was not showing them a single prescribed method for doing it. The lesson is not a rule book. It is closer to an orientation, a way of deciding what matters in a given moment. And 2 people who absorb the same orientation in the same household at the same age can apply it very differently in their adult lives without either of them being wrong about the underlying thing she was trying to show them. William's version is more institutional in the sense that it works within the framework of his role rather than departing from it. Harry's version is more personal in the sense that it follows his own emotional truth regardless of the institutional consequences. Whether either of them would recognize this framing or agree with it is not something anyone on the outside can know. What can be observed is that the lesson their mother was teaching has produced different results in different people, which is probably true of most things that matter. The complication that now shapes everything William does in his public life is the awareness that his own children are watching him the way he watched his mother. George, Charlotte, and Louis are at ages now where they are registering what their parents do and how they do it, what the job looks like from close range, what it costs, and what it gives back. William has spoken about this dimension of fatherhood in interviews that touch on it obliquely, in the way that careful people speak about things they are still working out. He has said that he wants his children to have a childhood before they have a role, that he and Catherine are deliberate about the boundary between the two. He has also said, with the kind of plainness that suggests genuine rather than performed feeling, that he thinks about his mother and what she would make of his children, and that thinking about them together is something he finds both difficult and important. The lesson Diana taught him is now something he's deciding how to pass on, not by talking about it explicitly, presumably, in the way that lessons delivered as explicit lessons rarely take, but by doing the work in the way she showed him it could be done, with genuine attention, genuine presence, the deliberate choice to be actually in the room with people rather than simply occupying the space. His children will absorb something from watching him do that. What they absorb will be their version of what he absorbed from watching her. It will not be the same thing because they are different people in a different time with a different mother, and the institution they are being prepared to inherit is changing in ways that none of them can fully predict. But something will carry forward. That is what lessons of this kind do. Diana did not deliver this particular lesson in a speech or a formal occasion. She delivered it in rooms that smelled of antiseptic, and in corridors of hospitals, in the early hours of the morning, and in visits to community centers in parts of Britain that did not normally expect a princess to show up and stay past the end of the program. She delivered it through the quality of her attention and the refusal to protect herself from the difficulty of what she was looking at. And her son watched and carried it and is still applying it, and his children are watching him. The watching is not incidental. It is the mechanism by which this kind of thing passes between generations. What makes this lesson durable across decades and across the enormous changes in William's circumstances since the years when he was absorbing it is that it is not a complicated idea. It is, at its core, an argument about what another person deserves from you when they are in front of you. Diana's answer was your actual attention, not a performance of attention, not the surface of presence while the rest of you is somewhere else managing the program or thinking about the next engagement or maintaining the distance that institutional life makes comfortable. The actual thing, the quality of being genuinely interested in what this particular person is going through and allowing that interest to be visible. Inside a monarchy that has spent centuries learning to operate through spectacle and ceremony and the power of a controlled distance, this is a form of subversion, not hostile subversion, not an attack on what the institution is, but a quiet insistence that the formal power of the role is less important in any individual human encounter than the quality of attention brought to it. Diana understood this intuitively. William understands it as something he learned, which is not the same, but produces similar results when it is applied with honesty rather than calculation. The people who have felt it, who have been in a room with him when he is operating at the standard his mother set, tend to describe something specific, the sense that he is actually listening, that the question he asked was a real question and not a ritual one, that the time he spent with them was not being visibly measured against the clock. That experience, for people who are not used to having the full attention of someone in his position, is not small. It changes how they feel about the encounter, about the institution he represents, about whether the monarchy is something that connects to their lives or simply something that exists on television and in newspaper photographs. Diana understood this was the most real thing the institution could offer ordinary people. William has not forgotten it. He will not.